Hello, in this video we are going to talk about informative speech organization. Now, sometimes I like to start off a section with a quote, and here we have the quote, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." And we're going to come back to that quote in a few minutes after discussing why we care about speech organization when you give a presentation. Now, more specifically, we're going to be discussing steps in developing a speech. So this is basically the process one goes through when determining a topic and then researching that topic to building the speech, right? Then we're going to talk about elements of a presentation, and these are the actual organizational components that you want to have in a speech and organizational patterns, focusing specifically in this video on informative organizational patterns, and then later we'll talk about persuasive organizational patterns in a future video. So, why do we care about organization? Why does this even matter? Well, research with audiences shows that it aids in content understanding and retention. So essentially, if you're organized, an audience is more likely to remember the main points, right? Remember what matters, and then also understand it. Okay. Uh, One of the things that I mentioned when we in the video on speech anxiety is that oftentimes presenters, or in any situation when you're communicating with somebody, you could be in a conference room with 5 people, right? It doesn't have to be a speech. The person talking will sometimes overestimate how much their audience is picking up, right? And I mentioned in that video and in that discussion that oftentimes you may make a mistake or you do something that shows you're nervous. Like think of a job interview, right? Like you may do things that show you're nervous in a job interview, but it's not like the interviewer catches everything, right? They're going to miss some stuff because they're not paying attention to everything. They didn't always know where you're going, right? And hey, spoiler, people space out, right? They're not always 100% focused on what you're saying. Well, the same thing happens here. If you're not organized, right, it can be hard for people to kind of understand what were the main points, right? What were the key points of emphasis if you didn't sort of clarify that for them, right? And so if there's a lot of information that they're getting and it's not really being filtered or presented in a way that's structured for them to know what do you really need to remember or take away from this, sometimes they just kind of they can lose a key point or a main point. So it really helps with memory, and it just helps with people understanding what matters, right? What to focus on. It can build what's called speaker and topic credibility. So there's two types of credibility in any persuasive message. Again, this doesn't just have to be a speech. This applies to any situation in life, right? So topic credibility is, do you think that the topic is legitimate or interesting or deserves, right, your attention in some way, right? Whether it's just a topic that you're just interested in or entertainment value, you name it, right? Speaker credibility, or another way to think of it is like messenger credibility, is basically, do you think the person giving you the info is credible about this? So this would be like, if there is a topic you're interested in and you go on YouTube and you search for videos on that topic, and let's say it's a topic you know a lot about, it's a hobby you're interested in, and you start watching that video and you get into that video and you just think it's not well done, right? Or they start to say some stuff because it's a hobby you know about, like you catch it right away, right? An example would be, I'm a big baseball fan. So I follow the sport very closely, and if somebody says something that's like really out of whack with baseball, I'm going to catch it right away because I follow baseball really closely, right? And they're going to lose credibility with you or with me in that scenario, right? Because you know the topic and they just said something out of whack. Now, when that happens, or you're watching, let's say you like a certain genre of film and you watch a movie and it's not very good, does that mean you decide I'm no longer interested in this hot topic? I hate this genre of film. No, it still has topic credibility for you, right? Like it still has value that way. You still think it's legitimate and interesting or worthwhile of your attention or time, but you don't think they're good at giving you the message, right? And so what happens here is if a presenter is organized, you are more likely to think, hey, not only do I think the topic's legitimate, but you're legitimate, right? You're the one who should be telling me about this, right? You're the one I should listen to. And so audiences will tend to, if you're organized, just kind of give you the benefit of the doubt that you know what you're talking about. Okay. Now, by the way, this should be a little disconcerting for you because what I just said is style over substance. So, with a lot of audiences, quite frankly, especially if they don't know a lot about the topics, they're not going to catch it if you say something out of whack. is for a lot of audiences, somebody can walk in the room, whether it's a speech or any kind of persuasive message, right? Just think of persuasion in a general sense. I know this we're talking about informative speaking here, but you could, but this applies to persuasion and informative speaking, right? When somebody gives a message, right? When I say it's style over substance, the reason this should be a little concerning for you is it's kind of saying that people will judge a lot of things very superficially, meaning if I'm organized, they will just give you the benefit of the doubt that what you're saying must be true, or you must know what you're talking about, right? And that can be a little scary. So, in other words, it's like saying if I come in the room and I tell you that today we're going to talk about why, we're going to talk about Bigfoot, unicorns, and Papa Smurf and why they're all real, right? If I'm organized with a lot of audiences who don't know much about Papa Smurf or unicorns, they're going to say, sure, totally real because I just happen to be organized, right? So that's not great, right? That's very shallow because organization is something that obviously can be very superficial. Like I can be organized and be totally like not giving you legitimate information, right? I could be lying to you. So I don't know if Bigfoot belongs in that conversation, right? I mean, we know Papa Smurf and unicorns aren't real. Bigfoot, a little debated. I don't know. Um, but anyway, so it does. Audiences will tend to think that you are credible, that the messenger is credible if you're organized. And it also can direct the scope of the conversation. And we don't talk much about this at this level of the video. And in this video, we're going to talk about a little bit more with persuasion. But it is a way to sort of frame things. Okay. An example would be it's basically like if you think of a topic and you say a box represents every possible angle of the topic, every dynamic you could think of is in the box, right? You basically, if you're organized, you can come in the room and you're going to say, oh, we're going to talk about the topic, but we're only going to talk about it from this perspective, this corner of the box up here, or this corner down here. And what you can do is you make irrelevant all the other arguments, right? Because you're saying, well, I'm only talking about it at this from this dynamic, right? It's like, so I'm an attorney, so it'd be like saying if I came in the room and I say, we are going to talk about whether something should be legal or illegal, but we're only going to talk about it from a federal constitutional level, or we're only versus a state level, right? And if I say we're only talking about it at the state level, then I'm trying to make irrelevant maybe some of the national broader arguments, right, or federal law arguments. So it's a way to frame things basically, and we'll talk more about that with persuasion. So before we kind of get into some of this, like this is why organization matters. These are all the reasons you should pay attention to it. But I had that quote at the beginning where I said, excuse me, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Well, if you are organized, right, if you prepare, then you're more likely to be successful, aka lucky, right? I mean, on one hand, if we think of luck in like a broader philosophical sense, obviously you can be lucky sometimes, right? Like, you can do all the right things, put yourself with anything in life, right? You can do all the right things to put yourself in a position to succeed or be successful or have things work out, and they just don't work out, right? They just don't. Nothing's a guarantee of success, even if you've prepared to be successful, right? And obviously, there's times when people don't prepare and they're just lucky, right? Things work out for them. But for the most part, success happens for a reason, right? It leaves clues, it leaves an evidence trail. And oftentimes, the evidence trail is you were prepared for the moment, right? And so, what that quote's trying to say is that luck isn't just about chance, it's about doing the work to give yourself a chance to take advantage of your opportunities. And that's really what speech organization is about. If you're organized, you are setting yourself up to be successful in the speech. You're certainly, as we've talked about here, you're setting yourself up to be successful in terms of the audience actually remembering and understanding what you're talking about, right? But also them thinking you're credible, right? Giving you the benefit of the doubt and then framing the scope of the conversation. So that's what this is really about. That's why organization matters. That's why you want to do it. So let's talk about, again, we're focusing on informative speech organizational patterns in this video, and then later we're talking about persuasive speaking. The basic difference, of course, is that when you're being informative, all you're doing is laying a foundation of information, right? You're describing something, you're explaining something, but you're not really telling people how to feel about it or what they should do, right? Or what steps to necessarily take next beyond learning more information, right? Maybe the only level of small persuasion going on is the notion that you should care about the topic, right? But you're not really telling them what to do. And in a persuasive setting, you're not only describing the topic, but you're actually telling people what step to take next, right? Whether it's what's like sort of the action step to do. So we're focused, but whether it's persuasion or informative, by the way, these steps as far as developing a speech are relatively the same. So what are the steps in developing a speech or any kind of persuasive message? So the first thing you want to do is identify your goals in a broad topic, okay? So you don't want to be thinking like pro or con. You don't want to be thinking, what are the benefits of, because by the way, when you do that, you're already kind of biasing your perspective, right? If I get on Google and I just search, what are the benefits of, so I have to pick something where this would throw you off. So if I said, I Google, what are the benefits of hypnosis? Okay. If I Google that, there's going to be stuff that comes up. I could get on YouTube, watch some benefits of hypnosis videos, and they may have valid points. It doesn't mean they're wrong, but here's the deal with that. You know what that's not going to pull up is there is no the Harvard psychology department does not have hypnosis 201 or hypnosis 400 or the grad department hypnosis 501. You want to know why? Because the mainstream psychiatric community does not recognize, and psychology community does not recognize hypnosis as being legitimate. They don't. There are no classes like that. Now, maybe it is legitimate. That doesn't mean it's not legitimate, but it means they don't recognize it as that, right? Well, if you only Google benefits, you're not going to hear the cons, right? And so you've already made a mistake. So you want to start with a really broad topic, just the topic of hypnosis itself, not pro or in that scenario, right? Not like good or bad, pro con. Because once you do that, you're already searching a biased side of results, right? So instead, you just want to be really generic, really broad with topics at first. And then you start to research it more. Or if you're going to do pro, always make sure you do con too, right? So you want to be researching really broadly. And then as you start to do that, identify who do you think is the target audience? Who would want to engage in this topic or be interested in this? And from that, you can identify a more specific purpose, like benefits or cons of hypnosis, right? Like textbooks will talk about this with public speaking about a specific purpose, right? So you have a broad purpose to inform or to inform about hypnosis, and maybe a more specific purpose like narrows it down or something like that, pro con or whatever it may be. Then you develop a motivational link, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes in this video, and your main points. And then you actually organize the presentation, and then you do your visual aids last. Why you should do the visual aids last, we're going to talk about a little bit later in the visual aids in our visual aids video. But that's actually really important that you don't just, what a lot of people do, kind of a rookie mistake is, I'm bored, so I just start getting on Google Images searching for things, right? To put in there. Don't do that. You want to do that last. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So that's basically the broad process of developing a speech. So we're going to talk about introductions, conclusions, and then organizational patterns. I like to kind of deal with introductions and conclusions first because they're actually very similar to each other. They kind of mirror image each other in many ways. So in your introduction, you have the following things. You've got an attention getter. You've got a motivational link. You want to establish speaker credibility. And then you have a thesis statement. And this should be about 10 to 15% of your speech. And same thing with your introduction. Now, that's actually not very long. So in a 5-minute speech, we are talking about maybe so the math is simple. In a 5-minute speech, 10% is 30 seconds, right? So we're only talking about 30, 40 seconds here. So in that type of a time frame. So if you don't want to spend 3 minutes getting into your topic in a 7-minute speech, for example, right? Because you're almost spending half the time. So you kind of want this to be quick and pretty clean. So we're going to go through some of these components here, and then we'll look at conclusions. So first of all, let's start out with attention getters. So these sometimes mix with motivational links, okay? And the most common attention getters usually are statistics, there are questions, there's quotes, you can use a story, personal examples, right? These are all kind of the common things. And they're ways to get people to care about a topic. Now, sometimes these will mesh with what is called your motivational link. So your motivational link, let me explain this, and then we'll get back to specific attention getters, because a lot of times these can get combined, but they don't have to combine them. But your motivation link is why your audience should care about your topic, and this is really important. This is something you need to like this comma right after the comma here. Right now, the right now part is something that if you like of the like top five things you remember about persuasion from this class, whether you ever give speeches at all, or just getting people, since we're talking about being informative, to care about something, that needs to be one of the five. Okay, right now. And here's why I'm emphasizing that. It is not good enough to get people to care. You have to get them to care today. You have to create urgency. Okay? The road of someday leads to the town of nowhere. Someday, someday, someday. Now, maybe that should have been the quote, right, for this section. And that is the difference between they care versus care right now. Because here's the problem. Okay? When you have a topic and you're like, you should care about the topic, the problem is that you are making the assumption that people will always do what they know they should. Right? What they know is the right thing to do. Or they always do, like if you care about something, you know you should care about something that you then always follow through. Is that what people do? Like the answer is no, right? I think I can answer that for everybody. I mean, if you think about it, the average person, they get up in the morning, by that afternoon, if you ask them today, have you done everything today that you know you should do? Right? Have you cared about and acted in a way that's like caring about all the things you should care about? You did the right thing, basically. What you know is the right thing all day today. Did you do it? No. Most people can't go half a day, let alone one day, doing the right thing. And if you walk in the room and you basically just tell people, like, here's my topic, you should care, you know it's the right thing, and you think that's going to make you some super successful closer and sell ice to Eskimos, meaning you can sell people on anything at any time, I got some oceanfront property to sell you in Arizona because you're wrong, to quote George Strait, right? There is no oceanfront property in Arizona. There's these misnomers that people have, and it's like it's build it and they will come. That's bull. They don't show up, right? That doesn't mean that. And so here it'd be like, let's say I give a speech and I'm like, you should drink more water because it's good for you. It's healthy. And I come in the room and I'm like I'm chucking free Aquafinas at you. Whoa. Is that going to make you drink more water? Well, you ponder that. I'm going to drink some Diet Coke here. They're not a sponsor of this video or channel. But I do have a Diet Coke problem. It's not going to make you drink more water. You're going to open a Red Bull while I'm talking. Right? Especially a college class, because you guys are young, right? You're invincible. You're going to live forever. That's not going to make you drink more water. You're going to be like, yeah, I know I should drink water, and I've got like 70 years to get my health in order and maybe drink more water later, right? Someday. Again, the road of someday leads to town of nowhere. You can't cash the check of potential, right? You need results. You got to get people to care today, because what a lot of people will do is they'll go, yeah, I agree, your topic matters, but I don't really have to do anything about it right now, right? And people don't do anything unless there's urgency. And if you have to do a speech or get people to care about the topic in the real world, if we're being informative, or you have to be persuasive and get them to change a mindset or behavior in the real world, you've got to get them to care today. You got to get them to do something right now, not just someday. So it's really important, that with a motivational link, that you give them a reason to care today, right? If I'm going to tell you to drink water, I got to be able to walk in the room and convince you that this is going to affect you in a major way, that you've got to start doing this now, right? That's the only way to move people. And so it's really important that you get that straight, that a motivational link has to be to get them to do this today. Okay? Otherwise, you're not really going to be very successful getting people to care about a topic if you're being informative or persuading them. So in terms of attention getters, now sometimes these can be merged with the motivational link because the attention getter itself gets you to care today. But they don't have to be combined. It just kind of is up to you. And again, I mentioned these are the most common ones: statistics, questions, stories, or quotes. Now here's the deal. This is kind of like something your grandfather would say, right? Your pop, I don't know. But the fleas come with the dog. You ever heard that one? The fleas come with. I got a lot of quotes, obviously. The fleas come with the dog. You know what that means? Good comes with the bad. Okay. There's. I'm more of a cat person. You might have heard my cat in the background meowing at me. Likes to come in to the office, and it hasn't made an appearance yet in these videos. But I think that I don't dislike dogs, but you have to walk them, and I barely walk myself, so I don't know. It's too much commitment for me, right? I don't know. Does that make me a Peter Pan? Does that say more about me than dogs? I don't know, but maybe I should get a dog. But maybe I need to walk myself more. I know I need to do that. All right, sorry, getting sidetracked. Um, okay, so there's good and bad about all these. So stats. What's great about stats is they can really emphasize how something matters, right? You can walk in the room and you say, 1 out of 3 of you is going to be impacted by A. And that's a way to get people to really start to care about A, right? If you do that. But the other thing about, but like, so that can work, right? But what can go wrong? Let's say I come in the room and I say, 2.5 million people last year were affected by this, right? Or 600,000 people were affected by that. That might be impactful, but the problem with that is that a lot of people? Like, if I say there were 500,000 people that died from something last year, is that a lot? I mean, on one hand, you could say one death is one death too many, but on the other hand, like, if I say 500,000 people died from A last year, well, what if 600,000 people died from heat waves last year? Right? I don't see like headlines and people getting really concerned about heat waves, right? So whatever it is I'm bringing to your attention caused less deaths than that, right? So one of the problems with stats is if you just give raw numbers, it's really hard for people to know what they mean. So if I say 3 million people in this state and state X were afflicted by or affected by something, well, okay, great, but how many people are in the state? Right? You could tell me it's 10 million. You could tell me it's 5. You could tell me twice as many were affected by Y and Z. Like, it's really hard with raw numbers to know what they mean, right? Is it a lot? Is it not a lot? So you're better off with numbers instead of just saying, several 100,000 or 2.6 million. You're better off just giving comparisons, like I did with the first statement where I said 1 out of 3, or if I said more people died from A than cancer, right? That is more likely to get people's attention. If you can have a stat that says like 1 out of every 2, or if you have a stat that shows more people are impacted by this than the other thing I know you already care about, or the other thing that I know already gets a lot of headlines, right? That's more likely to make the numbers impactful. Another thing about stats is you want to localize them. So give the stats that are local to that community, whether it's geographically, like within that state or community, or just that population. So if I'm giving a speech to a college class, you would want to give statistics that deal with college students, right? So localize the numbers, really show them in comparison versus like raw numbers. Now there's some exceptions to that. Sometimes just the raw number itself is enough to be impressive, but you have to like find the right lane to use them that way. Now questions, same things. It kind of depends on how you're using the question. So a couple of things. The way to use a question as an attention getter is the answer itself has to be surprising, right? The answer itself has to be something that like gets that creates the attention in the topic, right? So it can't be one of these obvious answer questions. It can't be a question where like in other words, like everybody would say that answer and it doesn't surprise anybody. So in other words, it's not good to start a speech or any kind of message, informative or persuasion, doesn't matter. And I say, who likes money? Who'd like to shave 10 hours off their work week? In other words, who wants to save time, right? That's not a good question to start a speech with. Do you want to know why? Because everybody likes money. Who doesn't? Everybody likes money. Everybody wants to save time. Would you like your morning routine to be more convenient? Yeah, no, please complicate it more. Right? Like these are things where everybody's going to say the same thing. You don't get anybody's attention by those types of questions, right? it doesn't mean those questions can't be used. We'll talk about those in a second. But you want the question, you want the answer to surprise people. Maybe one, I'm assuming you've heard this now, but like this might surprise some people, where it'd be like if I said, you should stop texting and driving, right? You guys hear this all the time. And by the way, you should. First of all, you can get ticketed for it in a lot of places. There's some states where you can get ticketed for even eating and driving, by the way, in your car, or having your phone even in your hand. Don't have to be doing anything with it. But it would be like if I said, what do you think is the number one cause of accidents? By the way, it's texting and driving in a lot of places. Like there's places where texting and driving has overtaken alcohol-related accidents. Okay, so like that might be a way. If I pose that in a question somehow, that might surprise some audiences. I think a lot of people are becoming aware of that now. But you want that type of question. You want the answer to be surprising. Now, by the way, the questions where it's an obvious answer, who wants to save money, those are okay, but you want to use those in the body of a speech as transitions. So, in other words, let's say I just talked about how something will save you money, and now I'm going to talk about my next main point is this will save you time, right? Now, if I said, who wants to shave 10 hours off their work week? And you go, I do, right? Or who wants to save some time? I do. Well, now that's perfectly fine because I can say, well, great. Now let's talk about how this will save you time, right? But you're already paying attention. You're hopefully already invested in the topic, and now I'm just using it as a rhetorical device to move me on to the next main point. So use the simple questions where you know what 99% of people are going to say, if not 100. Use that as transitions. Don't use it in your intro. Story time or personal examples. So stories can do a couple of things. They can personalize the topic. Okay, so when you tell this little story about they personalize maybe isn't the well. What I really should use here, what I really mean with this example is humanize the topic, right? You tell the story about little Billy and little Susan, and it makes people care now, right? You're putting a face to the topic and to the experience of and whatever it is you're talking about. And so it can humanize it. It can but it can also personalize it in the sense of if it's a personal example, right? It can make people. It can give you speaker credibility, right? Just like being organized does. I mean, you know this. Like learning is remembering. Sometimes you've thought of these things, maybe just haven't applied them in this context. But we all know this. If somebody has personal experience with something, we tend to give them like credibility on the topic, right? Well, you've been there. You've experienced it. And so if you give a story and you can say, hey, I've been there. It's a personal example like that. That will also personalize it and make people, it'll give you some credibility, right? So stories can humanize the topic. They can give you credibility or just give the topic in general credibility when you're telling that story about little Susan. So that's the good part of it, right? The other thing is we will remember things in narrative form. So there's arguments that are made in psychology that we're actually taught a little bit to learn in the form of stories. So like if you think about it, when you were a kid, you didn't tell your parents like, can you just read me a set of isolated facts? Can you read me some sabermetrics? I want to fall asleep to stats on usage rate and yards after catch in the NFL this year, right? Like read me some stats. No, you said read me a story, and you read a story, right? And so we're kind of taught to learn that way. And there's even studies of college students where you can give one group of college students a piece of paper and it lists like several facts on it. And you say, and there's studies that have been done like this where you say, okay, you tell them, okay, anybody, you have 24 hours, you come back, you'll take a test on these stats, on this information on the paper, and anybody who scores an 80% or above will get a $100 Amazon gift card, right? And you give another class the same group of facts, but what you do is you create a fake narrative, a fake story around those facts. Guess who's more likely to get the gift card? The group that has the fake story. So we tend to remember things better if there's a narrative built around it, a story built around it. The problem with stories, though, a couple things can go wrong. One is they just take a long time, and you might not have time to really weave a story into your presentation. Other things that can go wrong is an audience might not think the story is typical or a really good example. They might think it's more the exception than the rule. And so that can really kind of backfire on you, or they sometimes just don't pay attention to the things you want them to in the story. So it can definitely go wrong. So you have to sort of pick and choose. You got to make sure it's the right story to use as far as your for your presentation or any kind of like message that you're giving somebody. And then quotes. So quotes are really good at capsulizing a concept. Like they can make some quotes can do a really good thing in a couple of ways. So one is they can make complex topics simple. They can really kind of boil things down. So that's one of the great things about quotes. I think another thing about quotes is sometimes they can just make a point the best way, especially if the quote is weaving in maybe a good analogy or a good comparison or something else too. So quotes can be great, and it's not that you don't want to use any of these, but again, the point of this discussion is they all have good or bad. So what can go wrong with a quote? A couple things. There's usually two things that can go wrong. So the first thing that can go wrong is you give the quote that is like, you should laugh, love, and cry every day. That's a full day. And you're like, that is a full day. You just described my Tuesday. I did that today. I didn't do all those today. And then you're like, oh, wow, that's great. And you're like, by Ted Bundy. And you may say, I'm not going to go around. So in other words, you quote the person that everybody hates. And you're like, well, I don't go around quoting Ted Bundy. Well, you'd be surprised. How many people will quote somebody and they do no homework on that person at all? Look, there's lots of people that let's take today's age. There's people in what I mean by today's age. What I mean is basically like internet, in the sense of, internet provides a lot of, like, one of the advantages of the internet is it provides all these platforms, right, and ways to reach different people and hear different voices and perspectives. There's lots of people that are really successful on a given platform. Like, let's take YouTube, for example. There are people that are leading voices in a certain space on YouTube, on different spaces and fears and topics, right? That if you ever Google, they got millions of followers and everything's coming up roses. But if you ever Googled them outside of YouTube, you would see that they have got, like not just a skeleton, but houses full of, not just a closet, but houses full of skeletons. Like just a laundry list long of all kinds of awful things, sort of within their history, all kinds of baggage that you're not going to see on YouTube. Now, why is that? Well, let's think about this for a second. If you're a creator on YouTube, can you censor comments? Yes. Can you strike down videos that maybe point out that you're a fraud? Yes. So in other words, it's a controlled environment and it's easy to curate your reputation and image. And so I've seen that happen where I've been in classes where people come in and they give a speech and they quote somebody and I'm like, did you ever bother Googling them? Do you know they've been like fired from, I get they've got 10 million followers, but do you know they've been fired from like every place they ever worked for being, atrocious or a fraud? Right? Maybe you should try that. Try getting outside of that, the platform they're popular on, right? That they control, like what's said about them, right? Like it's just amazing how people don't do any kind of homework. So you do have to be careful about quoting the person that is not, either because you didn't do the homework, that maybe they kind of are the Ted Bundy, or maybe they're controversial within that sphere. So another example that I will sometimes use with people is, look, I'm not anti-Apple. I have an iPhone. I've got an iPad. I enjoy using them. But if I was at a software convention or some tech convention and I started quoting Steve Jobs, like, look, the general, like, American public, they like Apple and they like, we have documentaries about Steve Jobs and he's awesome and all this stuff. Well, in the tech field, if I go quote Steve Jobs, that's a little controversial. There's lots of people that don't think he was like the greatest guy and don't think Apple is like the good guy, so to speak. Right? There's some controversy there. A lot of the general public doesn't realize that, but within the tech space, they realize that. And so going around and quoting him that could backfire, right? So you got to pay attention to who you're quoting. The second thing that goes wrong is you give the quote that nobody understands. It's too deep, right? People, you give the quote and you're just like, look, this is an Instagram, man, where you give the quote and you're like, love is a stream, the passion flows. So on Instagram, I say love is a stream, the passion flows, and I put a picture of a waterfall, Multnomah Falls, in the Pacific Northwest. People are just I'm gonna get so many likes. People aren't even gonna get what the hell that means, but they'd be like, "It's awesome, man. That's really deep. I should like that. I don't understand it, but I should like it." By the way, I just made you Edgar Allan Poe, so you don't have to take your writing classes or English class. I'm gonna tell you the trick, and it's what I just did. All they do, I'm gonna make you Shakespeare, is say something and then say the exact same thing using synonyms or in reverse with synonyms. So in other words, what I just said was love is a river, and then I said the passion flows. So instead of love, I then said passion. Instead of river, I said flows. So there you go. You don't have to take writing classes. So my gift to you. That's not true. You should take writing classes. Okay. Look, you don't want to give the quote nobody understands. It's way too deep. It's way too whatever. Be careful about that too. You don't want the quote to distract. The quote needs to get the message across pretty succinctly and simply. So don't give too complicated of a quote. All right. So those are attention getters. That's a motivational link. Again, very important to get them to care right now. And then usually you will close an intro with a thesis statement. So a thesis statement is one sentence that previews your topic and your main points. So again, this is something in public speaking, which is called signposting. And if you've taken public speaking classes or any kind of training that, you've heard this before, it's this analogy, it's this metaphor for holding up a sign and showing your audience, this is where we're going next, right? So in this case, let's say, so I kind of use this example of if we were talking about health, like I gave you that example of drinking water. But if I said, my topic is obesity. So I said, today we're going to talk about the obesity epidemic, so that's my topic. And what are my main points? And I say, we're going to look at its likely causes, implications for our health, and available solutions, right? So those are the three main points. It's all in one sentence. It's previewing to the audience, hey, here's my topic. Here's what we're talking about. Here's what matters, right? Here's what you need to pay attention to when you take something from this speech. And then moving on to conclusions. Your conclusions, I mentioned this is kind of a mirror image of your intro, is you want to have a review statement, which is one sentence that reviews your topic and your main points. So again, today, we talked about the obesity epidemic. We looked at its likely causes, our implications for our health, and available solutions. Go back to that motivational link, whatever it was. Hopefully you've kind of continued to allude to it throughout the speech. But whatever motivational link you had to get them to try to care about this right now, try to go back to it here, and then tell them where to go for more information. This is also a really, really big one that people tend to leave off, is tell them how to learn. If you're being informative, it's just, again, it's literally where to go for more information, right? And that can be whatever it is, right, that you choose, that you think is a credible source. And if you're being persuasive, we'll talk more about this later, it's really incorporating an action step, okay? And there's a variety of action steps you can get people to try to take to help get them on that first step to getting involved, to sort of change a mindset or engage in a behavior that you're trying to get them to do if you're being persuasive. And again, this should be about 10 to 15% of your speech as far as a conclusion. So we're going to look at some organizational patterns. There's only, for informative speaking, a couple of other things just about the body of your speech is you do want to have about 3 to 4 main points in a presentation with clear transitions between those points. So again, in this hypothetical obesity speech, I'm looking at its likely causes, implications for our health, and available solutions. Those are the 3 main points. You want to have those transitions. So the transitions, again, I gave you that example of questions. It'd be like if I said, again, so we just talked about its implications for our health. Now let's talk about some solutions for weight management, right? And so you have a transition can be, and we're going to talk about this with delivery. A transition can be a lot of things. It can be a sentence like that. It can just be a statement. Let's talk about ways to manage your weight. or let's we talk about how this will save you time. Let's talk about how it'll save you money. It could be a statement. But as when we go through delivery, we're going to talk about how it doesn't just have to be a statement. You can combine other things. It could be a statement, and it could also be this is when you'd want to physically move across the room, right? This is when you'd want to refer to your visual aid. Okay. So you can do several things. This is when you could ask if you're good, right? If you're really comfortable with your delivery and you're good at it, you could ask a more provocative question, right? That where the audience really has to think, but that answer is, you kind of know what the answer is probably going to be, and that answer you're looking for will lead you to the next main point. So you could always do that too, but there's a variety of like sort of tactics, like tools in your tool belt that you can employ here. You want to appropriately arrange supporting material, right? And what I mean by that is kind of twofold. One is don't put all your eggs in one basket. So don't have a bunch of sources and examples for two main points, but then you have this other main point that you just don't have that stuff for, right? And because audiences can see through that. They're going to see the weak point and then just presume that point must not be very valid because you don't have a lot of evidence or support for it, okay? Another thing that I personally believe is I think it's always best to vary your evidence. So we're going to talk again more about this a little bit later, but you have types of arguments, right? You have, if you think of like Aristotle's three proofs, where you have logical appeals, emotional appeals, and appeals to credibility, right? I think that it is best to provide evidence in multiple platforms. So in other words, I think it's best when you have logos, ethos, and pathos, which are the names of those, right? I think it's best when you have logical appeals and emotional appeals and appeals to credibility. Prove things in more than one way. So in other words, don't just have a stat that says this happens to 1 out of 3 people. That may work, but you know what works even better? Is when you say, not only does this happen to 1 out of 3 people, but here's the story of little Billy. It happened to him too. Now I've got an emotional argument, right? And the doctor comes in and says, it's true. The doctor says, trust me, I'm a doctor. I've been doing this for 20 years. It did happen to Billy. Now I have an appeal to credibility, right? Bring more than just one like side of the argument in, because when you only rely on one, when you only have stats, or you only have emotional appeals, you're assuming that that's going to hit home with that audience, and that might not work with that audience, right? So I think it's best to prove things in more than one way. And then use an appropriate pattern. So let's talk a little bit about some emotional, some organizational speaking patterns here. Before we do that here, just this next slide. Again, this is what I was just mentioning. Avoid strings of similar evidence. Try to vary it. Use all 3 types of arguments. Balance your evidence, like I just said. And then the last little thing here that I wanted to mention is address opposing perspectives. So don't ignore the elephant in the room. So I mentioned that I'm also a lawyer, right? If there's a weak point in my case, I don't just not address it, right? Because sometimes you have to, and look, you can apply this to a lot of things in life, like just in your everyday lives, right? Personal and professional life, that when there is an elephant in the room, you kind of have, like, there's a topic, right? And you have this choice. Am I going to talk about it or not? Right? Am I going to address it or not? Well, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that for some things, if you don't address it, if you don't get ahead of the narrative and sort of give your explanation, other people are going to make up an explanation in their head. They're going to have their own narrative already, right? So just because I just don't bring up the weak point in my case to a jury, it doesn't mean they don't consider that point or the opposing evidence that looks bad for me. They're going to think about it on their own. So if they're going to think about it either way, I might as well say something about it, right? And so you have to think about that sometimes. That like, well, yeah, I could not say anything, but then if I don't say anything, I am leaving it, right? The narrative is just out of my hands versus you trying to get in front of it and just address it. So don't be afraid to address opposing perspectives. Now, usually in a public speaking setting, it's a job environment and you're trying to be persuasive. So if you're in those types of settings, usually you're selling something, right? You're trying to get people to buy into something. You're trying to persuade them for financial gain or something like that. And so a lot of times the elephant in the room is maybe another choice they could make or a competitor of yours, right? Well, you should talk about, it's okay to sometimes address like, okay, I want you to do A, and I understand the benefits of why somebody would choose to do B or go with the other option, right? And just talk about it. Like it's okay to address it, right? And what I'm just saying is the advantage of you addressing it is you can try to control their viewpoint on it. You get to frame it a little bit, right? By actually commenting on it. So don't just like ignore those things because they're still going to be thinking about them anyway, right? So you might as well address them. So, what are the organizational patterns that we tend to use with informative speeches? You've got chronological, which is basically in the order of time. So this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So this works for usually like historical presentations. This kind of works too for demonstrative speeches where you're saying first you do this step, then you do this step, then you do this step. So that's chronological. Spatial is not one that you're probably going to use very often. Again, sometimes for historical speeches or it's basically done more by location, right? Or direction. So you say, this is here, this is here, this is here, right? And so it's not as common of one, but that's one you can use. Cause and effect is you're just saying, here is the cause of something, and here's the effect of something. Here's the believed causes. It could be more than one, and here's the believed effects. Now, again, you're being informative. You're not saying necessarily like which cause is the most important, or we should care about the most, or which effect is the most important, and we should care about that effect the most. What you're really just doing is you're just discussing it, right? You're just laying it out there. You're not saying what's good or bad. Same thing with problem solution. You can describe various problems and talk about various solutions and not necessarily be promoting one or the other. You're just describing them, right? And then topical is by believed importance. So that's kind of the catch-all. This is when, hey, I don't think this fits any particular pattern, so I'm just going to go by what I think is the best flow of things. Probably the most common, like, and a good example, this would be deciding like, okay, I don't think this fits into any particular pattern, so I have to make a decision. Like, do I start with my weakest argument and then build up to my strongest? Do I start with my strongest argument and then go down to the weakest? Do I just, again, put them together in a mesh based on what I think, how I think it flows best? You just kind of make a call for that, right? Like based on what you want to do. By the way, that example about weakest to strongest or strongest to weakest, I think it depends on the topic. If it's a topic that you think people tend to not really care about, then I would usually start with the strongest one to try to get their attention, right? Like, this is why this matters. And if it's one where you think there's moderate support for already, or some people are going to care, then I think it's okay to maybe build up to the strongest, right? So that's kind of like something that you try to do. This kind of like also brings on a piece of nuance that people just don't understand, or don't seem to get, which is, again, so cause and effect or problem solution. You can talk about problems and potential solutions and still be informative and not being persuasive. Remember, persuasive is advocating for something. You're trying to get people to change a mindset or behavior. But just because you talk about problems and solutions doesn't mean you're promoting them. It doesn't mean you're saying this is the best solution. I'm just explaining the solution to you. And the reason I said a lot of people don't seem to understand this, it's like arguments. I can talk about arguments and still be informative and not be being persuasive. Also something people do not understand. And here's what I mean by that. Look, I can come in the room and give an informative speech on controversial topics, and it doesn't mean I'm biased. So, for example, I can give an informative speech on gun control, the death penalty, abortion. And if I give that speech, if I'm saying, here is the current state of gun control in the United States, and the arguments on both sides, well, or what I should say is this. I can't give that speech without talking about arguments on both sides, right? You're not really discussing gun control unless you say what people who are for or against it think. So I can do that, and still I'm being informative as long as I don't tell you one argument is right or not, right? As long as I don't say you should believe that, or they're right and the other side is clearly wrong, I'm still being informative. And the reason I say a lot of people don't understand that is because there's a lot of people where just because you describe something, they immediately jump on you as being biased. I'm not biased because I described something. If you don't like what I described, that's more an issue with you. It doesn't make me biased, right? just because somebody tells you the truth or describes a situation and says, here's what we know, that doesn't make you biased, right? What makes you biased is, or like pro or con is maybe a better word than biased, is when you then insert, I think they're right, or I think that viewpoint is right if it's something where there's two sides to, right? And so that tends to be lost on people. That obviously you can give a gun control speech and it's informative, and obviously you can give a gun control speech that's persuasive, or the death penalty, or pick any of those topics, right? So it's just a matter of, are you promoting that opinion, right? Versus just, I'm just describing the situation, right? There's a difference between describing the water and telling people they should swim or get out of the water, or the water is good or bad, right? And so you have to kind of know the difference. But being informative is just describing the situation. Problem, cause, solution. This is a specific one. So I just kind of wanted to I want to give you an example here of how you could organize those main points. So in a problem cause or a problem solution kind of scenario, either one, right, you could do this. So you have one main point that identifies the problem. And then a second main point explains its causes, right? What do we think? And again, this is assuming you're being informative. Here's what we believe are the leading causes, right? Not saying one is more important than the other, but like here's the general usual suspects, right? Good movie, by the way. It's the 90s, late 90s, I think, early 2000s. Whenever I reference a movie past 2000, though, in my in-person classes, people, they just give you the look, the students, right? You guys give me the look of like, you just don't know what I'm talking about. It could be in Klingon which is a travesty, because there are some movies that were before 2000 that you guys haven't seen that I think are personally offensive. Like, I don't know how you're living your life. But without seeing some of these movies, it's unbelievable. Some of the stuff you haven't seen. But The Usual Suspects, I want to say, it's late 90s, early 2000s. Good movie. Good movie. You should watch it. Crime movie if you like crime dramas. Anyway, sorry. So you explain its causes and you discuss the solutions, right? So that's what you can do. Simple 3 steps. So I just wanted to give you an example. You could certainly do this for an informative speech. And this allows you to be very detailed. And again, you just want to make sure you're staying neutral, right? You're not promoting one over the other. So hopefully this kind of gives you a good sort of overview of informative speaking. These are, again, the most common kind of patterns you'll use, but you don't have to fit a speech into any of these. So if it doesn't fit, just go by topical, which is kind of a catch-all. And that's just like, what's the flow, right? Like, if you think of this PowerPoint here, how I decided to organize this is really kind of a catch-all, because I just decided that, look, I think conclusions kind of mirror the intro, because you go back to you have a thesis statement and a review statement, one sentence that previews the topic and main points. You have the motivational link in both. They're both 10 to 15 seconds. So I decided to cover those right away, right? So, and together, and then talk about the patterns in the middle, because I think that that's the best sort of flow of discussing the topic, right? So if your informative speech doesn't fit into any of these, you can always just do a topical catch-all one, right? So it all just kind of varies based on what you do. But these aren't organizational patterns for informative speeches. Now, in a future video, we are going to talk about informative patterns for persuasive speeches, which are different. So make sure you check that out if that's a presentation you're working on, or just you're trying to build a persuasive message, right? We'll talk about some things to sort of keep in mind there. So I hope this was helpful, and I will catch you guys in the next video.